Perfect. Great. Welcome everybody to everybody's favourite webinar series, Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. So this is the online seminar series which is seeking to revolutionise the way in which conservation programmes and policies are both designed and delivered. Next slide. So you're in very good company here if you're at this webinar. There's now more than 1,800 people in this community registered for these webinar series that are regularly joining to learn about cutting edge causal inference methods and impact evaluation in conservation. And this webinar series is brought to you by a fabulous team. So I co-host it with Alan Blackman, who's with us today, but also Elias Cisneros chairs the Q&A session. And behind the scenes doing all the hard work is Renzo Gidais and Alex Karuna, who are here with us today. Next slide. So our aim is to advance evidence-based conservation efforts all around the world by just really pushing the promotion of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of actions and interventions. And of course, you can find out lots more and you can join our various social media channels shown there. Next slide. Most importantly, though, is our website. Do go to our website. The back catalogue of all the former webinars is up there, and it's absolutely a goldmine. So check that out. It's a beautiful new website built by Alex Karuna. So thanks, Alex. Next slide. And there are opportunities still for us for people to volunteer with us. So reach out. So today we've got a fabulous seminar from Professor Jan Börner from Bonn in Germany. And Jan is an absolute hero in the field of conservation impact evaluation. He's a real hero of mine. I've enjoyed many of his papers. In fact, they've been really seminal into my thinking in this area. So really very much looking forward to Jan's talk today. For those of you that made it, we had our last one in December was by Holly Booth about her randomized control trial in a marine pay-to-release program. And of course, that is on our website, the video recording of that, which Jan's will be as well after today. So a few housekeeping next, I think. So first of all, Jan is going to speak for about half an hour. Do post your questions in the chat as you're going along, because that gives Elias a bit of time to sort of plan on who he's going to call and what the themes that are emerging are. Of course, we will then be inviting you to unmute and ask your question. And the video will be available later. And if you are going to post about this on social media, which you're encouraged to do, encourage people to watch online or to sign up for future webinars, then use the hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. So over to you, Jan. So Jan's talk is titled Impact Evaluation at Borders and Other Spatial Discontinuities. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Thanks to the whole team and to everyone for joining. I hope you can see the screen and hear me well. Worked before, so hope it works now as well. Yeah, so maybe as a disclaimer, I realized when I started working on this presentation that I should have called it what I have learned, because some of you have been doing this much earlier than we started working on borders or at borders. And so we're just catching up, but I brought to you a couple of examples of the work we do. I just wanted to start maybe with some of the big questions. So 10, 15 years ago, when this whole idea of bringing impact evaluation to conservation started, we were mostly interested in what works and what not. I think we have done quite a good job on that. We still need more, but we are mainly also interested now in other things. So which mechanisms and moderators matter for the outcomes we are interested in, which trade-offs are there between conservation and non-conservation outcomes. There are improved outcome proxies. So basically, can we learn more about how land cover change translates into ecosystem services based on all the remote sensing that is going on? And there are many other things. So I selected the three first bullet points here because they are mostly linked to what I'll be talking about today. So as an outline, this is what I'll try to do. So talk a little bit about borders and conservation impact evaluation conceptually. I'm not going to go into much methodological detail. So if you came to hear about that, I have to disappoint you, but I recommend the paper here by David Wipper and Robert Finger, where you can learn much more about the, let's say, recent methodological developments. And then I'll focus on three, call that short stories, on other spatial discontinuities. So not necessarily national borders, but subnational borders, and try to extract some lessons from that. So for a starter, I found out recently that there is actually a whole discipline called border studies. In border studies, borders are actually considered institutions. I like that quote here. And if you think of borders as institutions, you actually have to think about history, power, relationships, economic interests that are behind where borders are placed and why they shift from time to time. And some of this also applies to borders of conservation policy instruments, such as protected areas. So often these lines are not drawn randomly. They are being drawn based on important considerations, be it some biophysical features, be it some economic interests, be it cultural boundaries. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we use borders in our identification strategies. I was lucky to be invited a couple of years ago by David to contribute to a paper that came out in 2024, which gives us a bit of a big picture. So here you see on the right-hand side the global average border discontinuity in forest cover. So basically always comparing the part of the border that has high forest cover with the part of the border that has the other side of the border that has low forest cover. It's a sizable discontinuity in forest conditions and related proxies of forest conditions at global borders. Of course, not all borders can be used, but those that can be used were used here. There's also some plausible correlation with the number of forest policies that countries implement, and this correlation is conditional on relevant moderators. You see that here at the bottom. So wherever forest policies coincide with rule of law, property rights, human development index, stringency of enforcement, this gap becomes closer. So this is good news that forest conservation policies can work here and there. But of course, that second part is not the rigorous causal part. The rigorous causal part is more the part where we can say, okay, there are discontinuities at borders. So somehow countries matter for forest cover. But the question is, can we learn more about this? Yeah? So in conservation impact evaluation, we're usually interested in whether or not a specific conservation or environmental policy works or why it works. And at these national borders, many things can change and have changed in the past and also evolve differently over time if you compare one side with the other. So this is why in the famous book here, Why Nations Fail, Acemoglu and Robinson have done a lot of these border studies, comparing left and right, up and below of borders, trying to understand what went different in the institutional development of these countries, and try to explain these differences in the context of relatively similar biophysical conditions. Conservation impact evaluation then is about mainly spatial discontinuities. There are some examples of studies that use other discontinuities, but I think most recently we are often interested in these spatial discontinuities that allow us to isolate the effect of a specific conservation policy. Yeah? And I just brought a few, let's say, examples from studies that have been done recently that illustrate the wide range of different questions you can answer. So people have used it to study protected areas, shown again that they reduce deforestation at global scale. A smart idea was to look at how culture moderates the response to agro-environmental policy reforms in Switzerland. Here we know that in Switzerland many cultures are separated by administrative boundaries. So you look within the country and see how the same policy plays out differently in different cultural contexts. And people have looked at territorial fishing rights and have shown that these increase fish stock recovery. People have looked at China's National Forest Protection Program and showed that increased forest cover, especially in these collectively managed forest lands, has increased. All these are some forms of regression discontinuity design. So just briefly how this works, this is an idealized setting, of course. What you do is you try to find some plausible spatial discontinuity in a policy treatment. Could be a country border or some administrative boundary. And you compare what happens at one side and what happens at the other side of the border. But this is not enough to actually identify the effect of a policy. And still, you have, of course, to make sure that many assumptions are fulfilled. I'll talk about some of these on the next slide. And in the second step, if you have before and after data, you use that to estimate the difference in discontinuities at this cutoff point. The border is here the cutoff point to get to a local average treatment effect. There are some parallels here to difference in difference, also to instrumental variables. The nice thing here is that you can actually use assignment criteria where the exclusion restriction of instrumental variables does not apply. So you have some more versatility when you use this approach at the local range around the border cutoff. So you can do some things that these other identification strategies or quasi-experimental evaluation techniques cannot do. Now, there are a number of threats to causal identification when you use this approach. One threat which you can easily test usually is that natural conditions often systematically change at borders. Some borders are rivers, some borders are mountain ranges. So you can't use those borders. You have to assume continuity of potential outcomes. So you'd have to assume that soils and other things, if you're interested in land use, climate conditions are relatively continuous at the border. Policy, of course, systematically affects movement of people and animals also across borders. Policy implementation systematically violates the de jure treatment criteria. So all these 2 points are linked to the idea of no endogenous sorting. So you shouldn't have that case that somehow people can manipulate the cutoff and move to the other side to influence changes there. The point is also linked to the idea of spillovers and leakage. So you have to make sure that this does not happen at the cutoff point. And of course, the more you look into subnational boundaries, stable unit treatment value assumptions might not be satisfied. So this is a threat. Another important threat is the rate of change in conservation outcomes that might differ at the border. You have to, if you do this before-after comparison, you have to assume parallel trends in your combination of difference and regression discontinuity design. The last important point is that you often have confounding events at the border in the same year. So if that happens, you cannot really claim that you have identified the effect of a specific policy. So if many policies change in a given year, then in the end, you know only what the compound effect of all these are, but not of the specific conservation policy you're interested in. And finally, and that then also applies to many of these border studies, that in the end, if all assumptions are fulfilled, you can be sure that you have internal validity. But extrapolating from border realities to the rest of the country or even the world is tricky, because often border realities are quite different from what's happening in the rest of the country. One study that has also done that, let's say in a bit more regionally confined setting, is the study by Burgess et al. That is cited a lot in this literature. So what they did is they compared forest loss at borders between Brazil and neighboring countries in the Amazon region. They basically assumed that forest policy changes in these other neighbor countries wasn't so marked as it was in the case in Brazil between 2003 and 2012, or maybe even 17. And they showed that you have this characteristic U-shaped discontinuity in the border, or change in the border. So before 2003-4, deforestation was high in the Amazon. The Lula government came in, implemented a lot of conservation policies. Deforestation went down, and then in 2012 there was a forest policy reform, and the law, the legal basis for policy implementation was weakened, and deforestation picked up again. The question here is which policies really matter. There's a lot of additional work that looked at different policy instruments showing which worked and which didn't. The countries also had differential exposure to multiple other events in the same period. So Brazil is a big soybean producer, so changes in soy prices affected land use change in Brazil more than in other countries. So all these things would have to be taken into account. Our thought at that point was, okay, can we perhaps learn more when we look at subnational borders? And this is what my 3 short stories are about. So you're going to hear now examples from 3 ongoing pieces of research with colleagues here in the group and also at other places where we looked at subnational borders. And the first border that we looked at was the Brazilian biome border. It's the border between the Amazon and the Cerrado. You see that here in black and gray. This is a buffer around that border. And some of the policies that were applied in Brazil, they were biome specific. So they applied only to the Amazon biome, but not in the Cerrado biome. Examples here are the soy moratorium and credit restrictions that were implemented in 2006 and 2008. You can also easily show that biome conditions across this border change continuously, so that potential threat is not a danger in this case. So we thought we should see some discontinuities in land use at the biome border. And what we did is we compared land use in 1 square kilometer grid cells in the buffer around the border over time and across strata of enforcement intensity. So we looked at where did the Brazilian Environmental Authority apply a lot of fines and where did it apply less fines. Of course, this is also all endogenous. Fines go where the deforestation is, but we know that the authority is limited by its budget, so it can't go everywhere. Here are some results. So no regressions involved here, just comparing the differences, sort of the gap in deforestation versus in Amazon versus Cerrado in percentage terms for different strata of enforcement intensity. So blue is high intensity, green is moderate, and reddish is low intensity. And what we find here is that at the biome border, there is a reduction. You see that at the line here. There's a reduction happening after 2008, and that can be pretty much attributed to all the policies that kicked in 2008 and that were biome specific. The soil moratorium is part of that. The credit restriction is part of it, but there were other things. Yeah? And we can also see that the strength of this reduction is somehow moderated by law enforcement intensity. We don't see that rebound effect that you saw in the previous study at that biome border. So it doesn't go up after 2012. It does go up at the end of the study period when the new government took over. And we all know that in that government period, deforestation went up again. And we also show in this analysis that land use intensification took place and was moderated by enforcement intensity. So a lot of pastures were converted to crop. So somehow the environmental policy also contributed to land use intensification in the region. So what are the takeaways here? So we knew from prior work that the soil moratorium and the credit restrictions and some other measures reduced deforestation. So that's not really new, but we did learn something about local enforcement as a moderator for policy effectiveness. I think that's an important insight. We always know that this matters, but I think in the context of Brazil, it matters in particular because there's always budgetary discussions about how much money the enforcement authorities get. But there are a number of border-specific threats to identification here. So various policy instruments coincided in the years that seem to matter. There's a long-standing politically motivated debate about what is really Cerrado and what is Amazon. There are some people who live in the Amazon but claim they live in the Cerrado. You cannot be sure that everyone always know where they are. So this border is a very different type of border than a national border, where people usually know on which part they live. There's data that you could use to test for endogenous sorting, but that data is problematic. It's self-declaratory. The environmental registry called CAR. So if you'd use that, you don't know whether people actually strategically registered more cars on one side or the other of the border. So that's problematic. And there could be an upward bias due to leakage. Some of the deforestation could have gone to the Cerrado. There are studies showing that this is happening. So that might lead us to actually overestimate the effect of the policy. So tricky when you move to these subnational borders. It's a special border. It's a very long border. You have a lot of observations, so you can do heterogeneous treatment effects, but you might not be able to do that at all subnational borders. Moving to the second story. This is a different continent, different country. We are looking at Namibia here. Namibia has an interesting colonization history in terms of land use zoning. So there were zoning laws 100 years ago almost that separated parts of the country into places where you're allowed to produce cattle for export. That's the red line you see on top of it. And so north of the red line, you're not allowed to produce cattle for export because of rinderpest and other diseases. And the blue line was you could say, colonial oppression instrument. It was a line where you were allowed to do commercial activities inside that line, but not outside that line. And you see there is this land of nowhere in between those two lines. So we were interested in both lines, actually, in the difference at the red lines and in the differences between outside and inside the blue line, or in between the lines, if you want, because that blue line was abandoned at the end of the colonial period. But it could still have had an effect on all sorts of outcomes. I'm going to show outcomes for the economic or wealth outcome that or results for the wealth outcome that we have looked at. We are still working on the land use outcome. But I think it's illustrative for what I want to show here. The problem when we started looking at the underlying data is that even 100 years ago, when these lines were drawn, people were obviously aware of the advantages and disadvantages of the agronomic suitability in the country. So the blue line, as you see here, was meticulously drawn to exclude areas with a high sand content and to make the places that are agriculturally usable available to the colonizers. There are also some other mining resources contained in the blue line. So here, one important identification threat is actually existing. So you can't use the blue line to do a proper RDD. If you look at the red line, there might be some sections where you could do it. But also the red line seems to somehow be drawn strategically to make sure that the good land in terms of agricultural suitability can be used by the people who made the rules, basically, right? On top of that, and I tell you that in advance, there has been a lot of voluntary enforced migration in Namibia across those lines. So people have been pushed by white settlers over the red line. So the area above the red line tends to be poor also because of what we would call endogenous sorting in RDD terminology. So we ended up not using RDD here. We ended up still comparing left and right, above and below the borders, but using a matching and OLS combination just to see what the differences are. And I'll show you that now. So here in this analysis, we matched settlements above and below the red line and try to see whether we can see differences. This is the International Wealth Index. So high values mean high wealth, low values mean low wealth. Matching worked quite well. If someone wants to see it, I can show a balance plot later. So you see here that actually the red line is somehow a border where people are separated into richer and poorer. And that is something that is existent until today. The same effect works if you just look at changes in wealth. So also the increase in wealth is lower above the red line over time than below the red line. If you look at the blue line, the effects are very small or insignificant. So a lot of things, a lot of development has happened, of course, when the blue line was removed. So you could call this good news. So somehow some of these historical disadvantages can be neutralized over time. But I think the truth is also that the people who have lived there in the Netherlands between the two lines have been partially pushed across the red line in the later settlement processes. So this is not the people who got richer, it's new people coming, replacing the people who have lived there before. So this is a case, sounded very interesting as an RDD case to us at the beginning, but as you see, it didn't work that way. So again, here the takeaways in terms of results, but perhaps more importantly, the line-specific threats to identification. So clearly, colonial zoning was absolutely strategic, leading to discontinuous economic and natural resource conditions at the relevant cutoffs. There was forced and voluntary migration, so you couldn't really use this due to endogenous sorting. But still, these lines have, one of the lines still matters until today. It's still there, by the way. And we also see that if you just look at where the red line goes, and you can see that it also has an effect on land use. So that's the next outcome we are going to look at. Last story is about what we can do with improved outcome proxies. So Noack et al. In 2022 have published an interesting paper looking at the role of farm size and what that means for biodiversity measured or proxied by bird observations. And they used the former inner German border as a cutoff. And we all know that, let's say, in former Eastern Germany, the agricultural policy was very, very different than in Western Germany. And this has resulted in a completely different farm structure. So this is nothing you have to prove. But of course, these different farm structures might have different effects on the environment. And here the case is shown for biodiversity. So put differently, we often know that policies affected land use. So the question is not, did the policy work? But we might want to know, what does it actually mean for conservation outcomes that go beyond land use and land use change? So what kind of proxies of ecosystem services could we learn about when we look at this? So this is on biodiversity. We based on a new remote sensing product that we got our hands on, wanted to know what land cover change or different types of land cover means for climate regulating functions at the local scale. Climate scientists tell us that landscape homogenization can affect these climate regulating functions, and examples are surface albedo, evapotranspiration, wind speed, and convection. If you have a very simplified landscape, large fields, very little tree elements in landscapes, you tend to get different local climate outcomes than in the more fragmented reality that you see here on the left-hand side, so the western part along the former inner German border. So our question was, are grasslands in the more homogeneous Eastern German landscapes more vulnerable to droughts than in the, let's say, more heterogeneous, more fragmented, more diverse Western German reality on the other part of the border? And these realities are still the same as they were 10, 15 years ago. The approach here was that we used a remote sensing product that measures the remotely sensed normalized difference fraction index. It's an index that basically tells you the vulnerability of the grassland to drought. So how much is affected by drought. And high values indicate predominance of dry vegetation, low values predominance of still relatively well watered parts of the landscape. The treatment here is a landscape simplification index, and that captures compositional and configurational heterogeneity. So not just how much forest is there and how much other things, but also how are they configured in space. So to be specific, one is the Shannon diversity index that goes into that, and the other one, the edge density, the landscape fragmentation measure. We use the two-stage least squares fuzzy RDD approach here to estimate this. And you can see already here that this landscape simplification really jumps at the border. So we would, if our theory is true, we would expect that this has some effect on the local climate, and it does. You can see here various specifications where we add different controls. You can see that in all these cases, the drought susceptibility or drought vulnerability on the eastern part of the border is significantly higher than in the western part of the border. Focusing on grassland here, just as a reminder. You can translate that into monetary figures by simply looking at what that means for grass yields. So we modeled grass yields here and found that this is actually quite relevant economically. So 16 to 52 euros per hectare revenue loss. What this doesn't tell you is that, of course, these large farms also have quite some economies of scale. So the question is it still economically profitable for them to live with these drought vulnerable grasslands, or are they actually making a loss that they could address by making landscape less homogeneous or introducing some variation in the landscape? We tested for a large range of potential confounders, soil texture, drainage technology, slopes, and there's also no measurable sorting here. So we're relatively confident that this is an RDD that properly worked. And it does provide some novel insights about land-atmosphere interactions. So it's not evidence on, but for nature conservation that can be used if governments, policymakers, landscape planners are interested in increasing somehow the land or changing the land use change to adapt to climate change. And as you have seen from the other paper by Frederick Norg, also biodiversity. We are not so worried, as I said, about threats to identification here, because we're not looking for effects of a specific policy, but rather at the mechanism through which the border, as an institution, has affected a conservation policy relevant outcome. Many of the threats, thanks to the data availability here, are actually testable. So coming to an end here, so what can we learn from borders and discontinuities? So I would say that these impact evaluations at national borders are generally really helpful to get the big picture. You can do things like asking over a period of time, did the government do a good job or not in reducing deforestation, like in the Burgess paper? But if you want to learn about individual policy impacts, you probably need to move to subnational or even policy-specific boundaries. And there you have a number of important potential threats to causal identification. If the borders are short, there's also limited scope to learn about moderators. And you always have that risk of bias, which inside a country, you have higher risk of spatial spillovers than across national borders. The question is, do you always find the right border situation to answer your question or not? Or do you have to rather look for the great border situation and then ask yourself, what kind of conservation-related research question can I answer with that? It's probably a combination of both. But if you then want to learn about a specific policy, you're probably left with many of the other impact evaluation approaches that are known, or you have to somehow combine them with the RDD approach. Where I see personally the most exciting area against the backdrop of improving sensor data and ever new remote sensing achievements in terms of measuring things that we thought can't be measured 5 years ago, is really to learn about how changes that we know exist at borders, how do they affect the conservation outcomes we really care about. So we often use land use as a proxy because it's easy to measure, but we actually want to know about the ecosystem services, all the biodiversity, all the contributions to climate change and whatnot. And as these measures get better, I think we can also use more of these subnational borders to learn about conservation impacts. So lots of people cited here, thanks to, of course, all the people who lead and contributed to the 3 stories I told you today. One is Javier Miranda, the other one, Marco Ferro, Vanessa Matuzzero, Christina Kiskatos, Wilke Hüttel, and a few others. So thanks to all of them, and looking forward to discussing whatever you'd like to discuss now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jan. And I really love that way of characterizing borders as time written in boundaries. I think that's fascinating and very kind of evocative. Great. Elias, I'll hand over to you to chair the questions.
So yeah, thank you very much, Jan. Maybe you can still share your slides so people can refer to a specific slide or something like that. Yeah, so please ask questions in the chat. As I don't see one yet. Of course, it's me to ask questions. So how do you think about? I think I see a little bit of this challenge here, because you say that borders are institutions, yes, and at the same time you said something about mechanisms, right? And I see the challenge always, right, as that RDDs can be more like a case study, because you never know what actually the treatment is, right? It's just an institutional change, right? But what within this institutional change changed, we don't know, right? So it's similar to what the economic literature has when you vote for if a female just won the elections, and the female now district has better development, yes. So let's say, yeah. So is it the female characteristic, or is it her all other characteristics that makes development better, right? And similar to this cases, right? Is it the other institutional surrounding? What is it in the institutional surrounding that changes, that actually makes the impact, right? So in this case, like RDDs to me sound sometimes, and that's what I think is have to be careful with. It's like an anecdotal description of what is going on.
Yeah, that's I think another way of describing the point I was trying to make. So I agree. It's basically when I say mechanism, and that's my last point here. I'm not saying that I'm proving that something is a mechanism, but if you look at some of these borders, and the German border is an example, you see by just looking at it that the landscape structure is different at one side than at the other. And you also know by history that some policy process, some institutional process in the past has caused that. So that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is how do these different landscape configurations play out in terms of environmental outcomes of interest, be it biodiversity or climate regulating functions of a landscape. That's what you can learn from this. You cannot learn about which policy caused it and which other mechanisms were at play. You can only say, I know land use is different. I know it has to do with the past. I'm not interested in what exactly happened, but I want to learn about how does this landscape produce or not produce ecosystem service in a discontinuous way here. And that's, I think, the exciting thing you can do at these borders. When you're lucky, and sometimes people are, you have really a situation where you can identify one specific policy that changed from one year to another at a border where all these conditions are met, and then you can also say something about the policy. But these are sort of lucky situations, right? More often, I think like we did in Namibia, you see, this looks great, let's do an RDD, and then you figure out, there are these problems. And in the end, I won't be able to say what it was, and then I have an outcome. I know it's there, but what caused it is the hard question that you can't answer. So yes, I think it's one more approach that can do wonderful things if you are not necessarily only interested in how a policy worked, how a specific policy worked. As new data becomes available, you can do new things with this, more in terms of learning about how nature works. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I have one question in the chat. What is the implication for policy implementation, extrapolation, external validity that RDD estimates an local average treatment effect? For example, if we find that a specific forest conservation works at the border, will it also work further from the border away?
Yeah, tough question, and I don't think I have a good answer to that. So I've seen in some of the studies where people looked at border realities to measure impacts, that they use data from the rest of the country to see to what extent is the border reality representative of the country reality. If you can show that, and in some border situations that might be the case, then you can have more confidence that what worked at the border might work in other places of the country. But still, you're looking at a specific country, so extrapolating beyond that country is tough. You first have to make the step of proving that the border situation is representative. So I would be very careful in translating these estimates to some, general policy recommendation. Because again, it's mainly a strategy to achieve internal validity. It's a local average treatment effect that is hard to extrapolate beyond the place where you have done it. So your label case study is actually hitting it, I think.
So do you think, again, like I invite people to put a question, right? So if not, it's my conversation. So let's see. So do you think that these spatial RDDs at the stage we have them at the moment in conservation science is like similar to what we saw with matching 10 years, 20, 15 years ago, where it's now matching plus panel data, right? And RDD now comes with panel data, right? So it's like one of the first things, and now we are developing to, let's say, RDDs plus time component, right? As you mentioned it also.
Yeah, I think that's a normal process in this. So if you are the first trying out something in a different domain, you can do it without investing too much time in making it very rigorous. But then more and more people jump on it, do it, and make it more sophisticated, and you get lots of methodological advance, and it becomes very, very hard to publish a paper using that approach. From the perspective of learning about conservation, that's actually a sad outcome, I think, because it will discourage many people who know about conservation to write interesting papers using those methods. And it becomes sort of a specialized area where people who invest a lot of time learning about a method can only make contributions in let's say, the disciplinary literature. So I think we probably need, more than just, and this is also, I understand the purpose of this lecture series, is to actually show that there are these methods. There are many questions we want to answer with them. Let's do it. I think again, if you have a really good question, you usually also find a journal that wants to publish it, even if the method is not 100% the latest state of the art.
Let me read out now a few questions. So, even if RDD estimate is biased, under uncertain circumstances, what are your thoughts on including RDD in a suite of identification strategies on a partial identification approach? Are there conditions under which the bias is so great that you think it's too questionable to include RDD in a analysis?
No, I'd say we should use all the methods we have and try to combine them to the extent possible to overcome these identification threats. I was just interested in learning a bit about, what are the limits of this method when I want to learn about conservation impact evaluation. And here I think combination is good, but if you're problem driven, then you shouldn't jump on just this one method. You need to look at what works for my problem. If you're opportunity driven, then you might run around and look for the best border to test something, but then you have to ask yourself, what can I test at this border? Like you do with instrumental variables as well, right? Some things can't be tested because assumptions are violated. So I understand that here we are rather problem-driven or problem-driven community. So the idea was just to share some thoughts about what the limits of this methodology are. And again, I think there are many situations where you might learn something from using it, but it's insufficient as one method. You need to look at the whole portfolio.
We have thought now a lot about spatial institutional borders, right? So Tanya also asked, do you have any idea of maybe a different RDD cases in our field of conservation? Like,
You mean different types of borders?
yes, different kinds of borders, discontinuities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the zoning example is an example of a non-administrative boundary, and the biome border actually as well. So these are borders that have been used to define the space of influence of a certain policy, or they are borders that were or lines that were drawn to simply restrict certain land uses within them and make sort of that region different from the region below. So, and I mentioned that at the beginning, there are people who use RDD at protected area boundaries. It's tricky because you have to, whenever you have that, you have to understand why did they draw the line there. And sometimes with protected areas, it has to do with settlements. So they are drawn around settlements. And then you have a completely different reality outside than inside. So that's all the things you have to check before you can rely on that as a strategy. But when you can't, there are usually other methods that you can use to at least learn something about that context. Yeah, I don't know whether that answered the question, but
I just wanted to, I found a space that I can talk in. It's really interesting, and I love regression discontinuity, and I wish that we could use it more in conservation. I think it's a very potentially clean approach to identification. And I was just wondering if you thought about, I know it's just repeating what we just asked, but I was just thinking more broadly about other assignment approaches. So for example, in conservation, there can be community-based conservation initiatives that are implemented by an organization according to set criteria. And that criteria can be fairly, I guess you could say, randomly chosen. I mean, there's always like, they have to score X on, and I'm working with an organization where they set these criteria. So there is a running variable, if you like, and there's a cutoff. Have you thought about that in general and bringing that into conservation? Because I don't think the conservation community is thinking that much in these terms, but have you thought about it, and do you have any other sort of broader thoughts about this?
And there are studies that look at other than spatial assignment criteria to study conservation outcomes. So credit lines, for example, are sometimes issued to farms up to a certain farm size. If you have reasonable heterogeneity in farm size, then you can use that farm size assignment criterion to look at, do the farms that are below the threshold behave differently than farms above the threshold. So I've seen that kind of stuff. And of course, that's a solution if the spatial assignment criterion fails, but only if you can reasonably define what the selection criteria are. Yeah, but that's of course a way out if the spatial boundary doesn't work. Yeah. And it is a way also to design impact evaluations for programs that start. So if you have the chance to discuss a new conservation program with an NGO or a government, and they don't want to do an RCT, of course you can discuss, well, let's define very clear assignment criteria for who is affected and who not, if that's possible. And then you can use that for the evaluation afterwards. So these are ways to maybe build your own RDD from scratch. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let me add to this. This is great. I think this is like RDDs, for example, employment programs or something like that, right? When there's the most important thing is like a clear cut. For conservation practitioners, if you make a clear cut, yes, also be aware that that these approaches need a lot of data. Yes, so you need a lot of participants on both sides, yeah, and close to the border, basically, right, in order for RDDs to work, right. So if you recommend it to a practitioner, then it's important that it's not like 10 people, right? It should be much more so that we can actually see a jump, yes, at the cutoff. Yeah. Julia.
Thank you. So I actually wanted to bring you, I've got two things. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to go into the other one. So actually, I'm going to bring you back to your final point in your discussion where you talked about improving sensor data and improving data sets and the kind of opportunities that opens up. And I'd just like to hear you reflect a little bit more on the kind of outcomes you think you might be able to explore. And also when you mentioned mechanisms, unpick a bit what you meant by that and what's possible.
Let me
I
start.
guess I'm trying to pick what's your next exciting project. I guess partly I'm trying to get at here.
Okay, then I start with that part of the question. Remote sensing is one thing, but we have a big program here in Bonn on using automatic sensors, so robots, flying robots or driving robots in the landscape, which use lots of sensors. And they can measure things that you can't measure with remote sensing technology, at least not from space. So these audio traps for insects and things like that, or birds. So I think there's a whole new generation of sensors and mobile sensors that generate data at some point in time where that you might be able to use for these purposes. And comparing how outcomes measured by these sensors change depending on the type of landscape they operate in, or the types of agricultural fields they operate in. So that's one thing with remote sensing getting better, of course. We might learn much more about combinations of landscape elements. So not just how much is there of one crop or the other, but how they are configured in space. What does that mean for agricultural and other biodiversity? So that's what I mean in terms of new sensor data coming up. And I don't have the next most exciting remote sensing product in my hands right now, but I'm expecting more to come out relatively soon. Just quickly on mechanisms. So what I just mean here is that in the German case study I presented, you could call the land cover configuration a mechanism. because it was changed by some policy in the past, right? There might be many other mechanisms, but we know this is a mechanism that was changed by something. And we just look now at how that affects the conservation outcome of interest. Yeah, so we are not anymore in the realm of policy impact evaluation. We are more in the realm of like a natural landscape level experiment where we want to see what is the effect of different land cover configurations on a given outcome. So no policy involved here, rather natural relationships that we're trying to understand better. And that can't be done, that kind of stuff can't be done in an experiment because you need it to happen at a much larger spatial scale to be relevant for regional climate functions such as rainfall and surface temperature and things like that. So does that explain the question about the mechanisms?
I think so. No, I think that was excellent. And we're going to have to start to draw this to a close, unfortunately. I don't know, let's just squeeze in Ivan's question, shall we? Do you want to go back to the chat? We've got 2 minutes. I thought we should just squeeze it in. No, let's not. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. We'll close. So thank you so much, Jan. That was incredibly informative and fascinating. It's definitely going to be one I'm going to listen to again and take notes, because there was a lot I didn't get in there. It's a very rich discussion, a very rich presentation. So thank you. For everybody in the audience, remember our next one is actually exactly a month today. So it's Santiago Savarida, and he hasn't given us a title yet, but we'll circulate it as soon as we have it. So be there, and of course spread the word and let people know they can watch this on catch up. So thank you again, Jan. Let's all give a round of applause, virtually or otherwise.
Thank you.